If you do have any questions or having trouble with the system, you can use the question box on the right, or email Laura Anderson if you're having connectivity issues. Which I'm assuming that if you can hear this, you're not. We'll be starting in just a moment. It's 2 minutes past the hour, and it looks from our screen like a few more people are signing in. So give us 1 to 2 minutes, and then we'll get started. Hopefully you can all see the screen. Some of you I know were uh, in the field or out and about, and I think we've sent slides to you. But for those of you who are able to log on, it would be great if you could take a look, because we're going to look through some examples of data that is broken down by school level today from a few of our partners, and the visuals will be helpful. So hopefully you can see the screen right now. You should be seeing a screen that says Financial Transparency Working Group and our nickname, the Fitwig.
And if you're on the phone and you would like the slides, you can send me a quick email and I can shoot them over to you.
That's Katie, so you can send an email to Katie Hagan.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We have a good number of folks on the call. Looks like about 50 people, so it's really exciting. You have your hand raise tool if you would like to be unmuted. Otherwise, everyone is muted. And then you have a question function, and any question that you post in there will be able to be seen by everyone. We want to encourage as much participation as possible, so post questions, comments, anything you want us to address, we'll be happy to do so, and we'll be monitoring that question box as we move forward. So just run through our agenda really quickly. I'll have a couple of updates for you, and then the bulk of our meeting today is going to be reviewing existing examples, talking through some questions and challenges of meeting this financial transparency requirement. And we have 4 partners that are going to be helping us in sharing some data examples that they have, and then we'll talk through a data inventory at the end. My quick updates are just the in-person meeting. I had a couple of questions about that over the last 2 weeks. So it's February 8th to 10th of next year in Washington, D.C. Travel expenses are not covered as a part of the working group, though we've had some conversations with some partners. If you need funding, travel assistance, feel free to reach out to me and we can brainstorm on ways to do that together.
And you might even, if you have affiliations with groups that occasionally fund travel, check with them, and maybe even your regional labs as well might be another possibility.
Yeah. And a couple of states have asked if they still need to identify an LEA. We're currently at capacity for these webinar series, so you do not need to do that. Again, there are some options if you would like to work with LEAs separately outside of this working group. We have a couple of states that are kind of forming their own little mini working groups with some LEAs. We can talk through those as well. Just reach out to me. And as you're going to see today, we have a couple of partners on the call who are sharing some of their work products. If you have things that are similar to this that you would like to share with the working group as well, let me know and we can work them into the meetings as it fits.
And just so you know, we do have a lot of LEAs already in the working group, which is great. So if there isn't one from your state, it's not that you won't have access to hearing the LEA perspective. They are included, just maybe not one from your state. So so hopefully that'll be a good presence. Okay, so this is Marguerite, and we're going to jump in. We promised to do a kind of a cheesy meme every time when we did these slides, and we're going to try to do that. But our first batch of stuff today are examples of what school-level financial data analysis can produce, and some of the questions raised. So anyway, there are a lot of questions. We've interspersed some with the data that we have, and I'm sure you will have more. So type them in the question box if you have. A lot of the questions at this point are almost placeholders for issues that we'll tackle as a working group, and so hopefully you'll be looking at this stuff saying it doesn't give it everything. So one thing I should point out is the analysis that we brought here today is not analysis done to meet this requirement. It was analysis done for other reasons. So each time you see something, it may have some interesting bits in it. It may be missing something, in part because it wasn't designed to meet the ESSA requirement. The ESSA requirement is pretty specific. It says that states will have to report spending broken out, with federal money broken out by school, and do so in a way that also provides the data on the school level report cards, where, as you know, there is also performance data. So, and that it must include the real salaries of the employees, and it has to be broken out in certain categories that include both personnel and non-personnel expenditures. So it's very different from the supplement, not supplant requirement, which, as many of you know, is at the moment still under in flux, because regulations are being written and revised and reacted to on how to meet that supplement, not supplant requirement. So if you're new to this call, you know that you may have heard, some of you may have heard last time, some of you may have been reading up on this, but the supplement, not supplant requirement actually imposes, or could impose, depending on how the regulations get written, restrictions for LEAs to spend their money equitably across schools. We don't yet really know how that'll play out, but that is very different from the financial transparency requirement. And the financial transparency requirement does not come with any prescriptions for how money is spent. It's just saying, show us how much is spent in each location. So anyway, we're going to jump into some of these examples because we thought early on in this working group it would help all of us if we could look at some real data and know what in the world we're talking about. So we have some partners on the phone or on the call, including Afton Partners and DMC and ERS, who are going to help us walk through some of these data, but I'll get us kicked off here. So first up is Afton Partners, and Carrie Stewart from Afton shared these slides, and I think right now she may or may not be on, but if you are on and need to be unmuted, raise your hand and we'll make sure that you can chime in. But Afton was able to do some analysis. I think this district is not named, but within a district on how the spending varied across schools. And you can see this is a relatively high spending district. If you see numbers like $20,000 per pupil, those are higher spending than the national norm, and you can see right away that they vary from 20,000 all the way down to 16,000, with a range in this particular district and this says it in the title, of 4,483. And that alone gives us some questions here, because we don't yet know enough to know what these spending patterns mean. Do the ones on the left have most of the special ed students, and so on? And that first question is, what metrics or adjustments or other kinds of things can help make sense of the numbers, given that schools have very different student needs? So we know that some schools will have a lot of low-income students and may receive extra funding for Title I. Some may have a lot of students with disabilities or bilingual education students or so on. And so how do we take stock of that in these spending numbers? Because spending numbers alone don't tell us much. So Afton, jumping on to the next slide, actually does their own adjustment, and they look at an adjustment, and we're not going to share all these methodologies because that'll be the topic of a totally separate meeting, but they have a methodology to take stock of the different spending by different student type, and what they do is adjust the spending afterwards relative to that. And you'll see that there's a little bit more equity created in this particular batch, but the schools sort of move around after you do these adjustments as well. And that brings us to this next question. Sort of what patterns and even inequities will we find when the data are parsed by school? So we want, hopefully as part of this working group, that you'll have a chance to kind of dig in and get a sense of that. So both as LEAs and SEAs, you're sort of ready and able to explain those patterns or identify work that you feel like you want to do to address the patterns. So this slide, maybe I'll give a chance. I don't know if anyone from Afton wants to chime in or not. No? Okay. So this next slide is a slide by ERS, Education Resource Strategies. We have Jonathan on, as well as Weston from Indianapolis Public Schools, where the analysis was done. And what you can see here is that these are the school attributed dollars per pupil across the different schools, and the mean is a little over 7,000, but there are schools on the high and the low end as well. And really quite a bigger spread here for the high-low spread, as they show, is 1.9 with a median at 7.2, a little over 7,000. And the schools are color-coded, choice, and traditional schools. And of course, this raises some questions for this kind of data. And one is, what about dollars that are not attributed to schools? So what's in, what's out when we have those kinds of calculations? And they might be different by different district, which can be tricky, because then we would maybe need to make adjustments to sort of recognize that one district might be attributing more dollars than another. So I'll say that and pause for a second and invite Weston and Sam, I'm sorry, Weston and Jonathan to chime in and give us any context here.
This is Weston at IPS. From what I can see on the slide that is on the display, I don't know if I don't know if the slide is really capturing specifically what how the spectrum should flow. I don't know if there's a PowerPoint conversion to the PDF. I think there's some translation. But all that said, what we learned, this is 14-15 data. We're utilizing data like this to structure our weighted student formula through our student-based allocation implementation for the school year 17-18. What we learned from this initial analysis was that the variation on equity really had no causation. It was literally the ERS team could not explain it. But the big takeaway that we had was the infrastructure and the portfolio structure that we have as far as a lot of small schools, and then putting grade configurations with small class sizes really is if there was a determinant on this equity graph, that was the main driver of inequity. The lines there's one on the far right. They've been differentiated between high school and elementary school, and I don't think we really see the high schools as well on this.
Yeah, and I'll show you we have another one of your slides, so maybe before I leave you hanging on that, I'll show that.
But there's a lot more inequity in the high schools than the elementary schools is one of the takeaways from that, and some of that had to do with just the utilization of those buildings and what types of demographics were in those schools. Since 14-15, though, there was a new superintendent. Myself as a CFO, I mean, the data is only as good as what it is. And since 14-15 and going into 17-18, we've really changed a couple of our accounting framework and how we're actually allocating dollars to schools on an annual basis. And so our data, I think, is going to be better looking forward. If we were to look at like a 16-17 or a 15-16 school year and look at the same type of data, we've also had, with new administration and need for looking at our grade configurations and also looking at the facilities utilization being very, very low at some schools, is saying, over the course of time from 14-15 to 17-18 or even 18-19, the district portfolio is going to look drastically different than what this year shows. And so we have new innovation schools, we have closing of high schools, we have grade configurations changing at separate elementaries. But overall, the ERS analysis has helped us, I think, make more informed decisions and have a better understanding of where our dollars are flowing and then why those dollars are flowing there. I think it's a step in the right direction, and we're great to have them as partners to our district.
And I think that is really showing the power of this data. And we did admittedly just sort of take snapshots out because we wanted people able to see some data and say, oh, okay, well, I get what we're talking about here. But the fact that we have places like Indianapolis that are ahead of the requirement and using these kind of data because they're relevant and informative and influencing what you do, and noticing that once you dive into the data, then some changes might need to be changed about how you collect the data. But even so, what you're finding is really informing decisions you're making going forward. And what you just explained, I think, is really the power of what the data can bring for an individual district, but for the system in general. So there will be a lot of different patterns, and they'll vary based on district. And I will show you this next one, and we can go back if you need, which was also in this slide set, which was just some of the patterns that ERS was able to highlight early on in the IPS data, particularly that the high schools were costing more, which is what you just said. At Magnet and Choice wasn't much of an issue. Either was teacher compensation. In other words, salaries were not as big of an issue in IPS, but that size and grade level did. And those are some of the things that you just pointed out. But I think it's really powerful that where this analysis has already gone on before the requirement it's been of value.
I'd also add one more point. There's IPS, I think, perception-wise, just from the media, from the community, there's some financial trust that we needed to earn. And once we had this analysis done, and literally we had some of our biggest critics on the finances. I mean, we may have our academic troubles, but finances was making the headlines for whatever reason. We were able to show, here's our cost per school. The state of Indiana doesn't require us to do that, and so we've never really had that as a reporting mechanism out as far as a messaging piece. And by us being able to do this publicly, it's really stopped a lot of the chatter as that being an issue with IPS. I mean, they'll always have issues, but being able to say, this is what we know is cost per school. Now, it might be right or not as far as following the needs versus not following the needs, but the fact that we could say we've looked at this at a deep level and we know what our cost per school, and we're trying to figure out why and then make it better, that has really, really, really helped us in our community engagement and helped us earn some of the trust back here in our community.
That's good to hear, because I think there's a lot of nervousness out there on whether or not these things are going to actually hurt relationships with districts versus help them. So I think that's great to hear.
I think where it can hurt is that the media wants to go after who's going to lose if you do some of these types of student-based allocation, and specifically in that graph why we were highlighting choice versus traditional school is because the narrative in IPS and Indianapolis was that, well, if you guys do student-based allocation, the choice programs are going to all be on the right-hand side. They're all going to be the highest funded schools. And in reality, the point there on this slide is that the magnet choice schools, the funding patterns were similar to the neighborhood schools. Mm-hmm. And so to basically address that false narrative out in our community, and it's kind of not been an issue since that was shared. So it's helped us with our messaging.
Good.
Jordan, did you want to add something?
Hey, this is Jonathan. I just stepped in for a couple minutes here. I'd say a couple things building on Weston's insights and the overall IPS experience. So one is what's really important about looking at that. If you go back one slide, if you just looking at the dollar per pupil across every school, these are, to be clear, adjusted for student need. And the requirement is straight dollars unadjusted for student need. Now, there's a whole complicated sort of thing that ERS does to be able to adjust for student need in ways that we feel like are reasonable and correct. But one risk that we've got that we're going to pick up with the cohort that we're working with Weston and some other districts, one of the ideas that we're going to pick up is, we actually think that schools that have higher concentrations of higher needs kids should get more resources. And equal design.
I'll just warn you that we did touch on this already in the earlier part, that that everybody will want to display their data in a way that it just doesn't make a school with a lot of special ed kids look just excessively expensive. That you'll want to either parse the data or carve the data or use innovative metrics to do that. And right now, a lot of the different analysis groups are using different metrics, and so that'll be one of the things that each state will have to decide according to the law of what methods you want to use, and we will have entire meetings on that one. Super.
Okay. Well, apologies that's what I get for stepping in.
Yep, that's what you did. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just want to let you know that don't worry, no. We hadn't blindsided people about that, but it's worth noting that the ERS data has already been adjusted as well.
The other thing that is that, again, apologies if you've been down this path before, but at the end of the day, transparency is a vehicle for advocacy and conversation. And so, like, the game here is how do we actually engage folks in ways that enable them to advocate around strategic stuff. And so to Weston's, so just the last thing you were saying, Weston, about sort of the perceptions around magnets and not magnets and so on, you could imagine that in the absence of this kind of transparency, you would have fought an uphill battle advocacy-wise because people would have been actually arguing for incorrect things. And so as we think about the design of what we're trying to build out, we need to be thinking about, I think, what are the strategy challenges, and how do we make sure that the way that we're engaging folks in data transparently actually points them toward those and not toward these like false, sort of false positives.
So I think we're hitting on those issues as well. I mean, one of the points for the working group is that you have to meet the federal requirement. It doesn't mean you only have to meet the federal requirement. You can add on more displays, more ways of carving up the numbers that do more to add more credibility and clarity. That you do have to meet the federal requirement. You can make change over time. It doesn't mean that's the only thing you have to do with these data. And different districts and different states will have different priorities about what else they want to show with their financial data. But I'll jump back and just to tie up the IPS one for a moment. So in Indianapolis, and I'll just summarize for you, the high schools we're spending more, the small schools I think we're spending more, not real patterns around choice, which was a surprise. Also not, turns out teacher salary, I guess, wasn't as determinate as many districts are worrying. But that raises the question, what do you make of patterns that exist in some districts and not others? So for instance, in Indianapolis, the high schools cost more. They don't always cost more. Should we do adjustments for high schools when some districts have higher cost high schools and some might have lower cost high schools? Should we do adjustments for size when some places have higher spending on smallness and some don't? And so those will be more questions to sort of to pull into this that are raised each time we do analysis. I think you'll see why it's such important work to do in an iterative way, is because the patterns that emerge inform the next analysis that you want to do.
And we have a question from Robert O'Donnell in Massachusetts, and he said, did the adjustments made to the raw data satisfy the skeptics or create more skeptics because the adjustments may not be understood? So Weston, I'm going to let you answer that.
I haven't seen that question come up where the skeptics asked that. But I think
so the more data they saw, the better they felt, not the more.
Before nothing was given to them. The fact that something was given to them and they knew that we were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on this, they were like, you know what? They're committed to this. This is a real. They believe in this, and they're making good. This makes sense to them that they.
Yeah, I think Robert.
They at least gave us something.
Yeah, but I think Robert's question is, if these numbers aren't the real dollars that are spent on each school, that they've been quote unquote adjusted, soon somebody will say, I don't like the adjusting you've been doing, and it seems like a black box or whatever. So it will be important over time to make sure people know exactly what they've looked at, not assume that somebody behind the curtain has changed the numbers on them.
Right. I think for us, this was inside an analysis that we as a district had done, and part of the desire was to have ERS compare us against benchmarks. And so for us, the ability for us to say that we were benchmarking ourselves against other like districts, and that ERS, a third party, has this methodology. I think if there was a question or two that may have come up, I think people understood that it wasn't just IPS is handpicking this type of analysis. It's a broader view, and ERS has had an ability to come in and present on multiple other analyses and fronts. One, for example, leadership and management, our central office spend. They do the same type of thing, but because I think ERS has the credibility, at least within IPS conversations, because they've been around for about the last 18, 24 months helping us with these analyses, I think people have come to trust, at least here's a well-respected group, has national presence, that is, making, I think, relevant points, and showing where Indianapolis stands across the nation, understanding that there's a methodology of it.
Great. Well, I want to dig in because we got some more data and we got a few more things to do to compare some data analysis that goes beyond just a single district, but starts to compare schools across several districts or all districts in a state, because that is the challenge the SEAs will have, which is that you basically got to produce numbers that allow you to look at Maple Leaf Elementary, that might be in one corner of the state, and compare it to Cedar Elementary, which might be in a completely different corner of the state. Maybe it's a different type of school, maybe it's in a different district, maybe it's a charter, and so on. And that's the task for the SEAs. So we brought a few examples. One is, by us, and it raises this question of what performance information can help make the data more useful. And remember that the financial data is going to be on these report cards where they are also exist performance information. And that's really kind of the upside of this opportunity, is to be able to pair those two. Because financial data by itself can tell you about equity, but what it does when it's paired with performance is allow you to start thinking about productivity, or whether or not individual schools or groups of schools are able to leverage their dollars to get the greatest outcome possible relative to their peers. So we did this analysis of some of the California schools. So there's multiple districts and charter CMOs present here. And what you can see, the horizontal at the bottom, even though there are only numbers there, it's spending. It's also been adjusted, so it's actually percentage of what the state gives out on average per pupil or per pupil type. So it's not an easy to read graph here, but a positive 20 would mean that school is getting 20% more than what the state gives out. The state and the federal government and locally is available for each different student type. So that's the way this analysis was done. And then on the vertical is performance, and the way the performance was done here is whether or not each batch of students was beating or lagging the odds for that batch of students. So we know that low-income students on average score lower, so we were looking at that as the reference point and saying, are they beating the average for low-income students, or are they lagging the average for low-income students? And what you can see is really there's quite a bit of variation. There is some upward sloping here, but there's not a whole lot of relationship between the spending and the outcomes yet, which is something that we're all hoping that the data will be able to produce over time. But this raises some questions like what filters are important, because it's never useful for schools, if you're a low-income school, to be compared on a performance or spending basis to a wealthy school. Or if you're a tiny little elementary school and somebody says, look, there's a school over here that's beating you, and you say, that is a 3,000 student public high school, which is not relevant at all. So you can see on the left, some filters have been built in that would allow people to select their own district or select different student types, potentially look at different mix of students, poverty, those kinds of things. And when you do that, I've selected here elementary and high poverty. So these are all low-income, really low-income elementary schools in those sets. And what you see is that the range of variation really comes down quite a bit, although there's still quite a bit of performance variation. So now when you're looking at spending, you might say, well, here's some schools, maybe one at the bottom and one at the top, that spend about the same. They're both elementary schools. They both have really high poverty populations, but get really different outcomes. And you can see this will open up, a whole set of opportunities to talk about that relationship between spending and outcomes, and potentially how schools might learn from each other, might explore what other schools are doing, might talk to their own staff about what their expectations are, and so on. I'll pause there before jumping in the next batch of data to see if you have any questions or comments. I'm the sort of host for that one because that's Edunomics Lab data. All right. I hope we're not just exhausting you all with all these visual data things. We have a little bit more to go. This is from DMC in Massachusetts. It's been working with Rob from the Massachusetts Department of Ed to pull displays from some of the data that is available right now in Massachusetts. And you can see they're also able to visually show different schools, both on the spending on the horizontal and the performance. The left one uses student growth, which is another really relevant performance metric for many places. And on the right, it's percent proficient. So you're looking at batches of kids that are meeting some sort of threshold. And what you see in both of these is school-based instructional spending. And instructional spending is, and it says one Massachusetts district, but it's not. There are multiple districts there, but they're highlighted against their peer districts. And so the individual schools are from several peer districts there. I guess part of what question this raises is how do we capture all the spending so to make sure we can compare schools across different districts when some may have more a larger or a smaller portion of their money put in like this bucket of instruction, for instance. And I'll pause here and let either Sam from DMC or Rob from the Massachusetts Department of Ed to chime in and give some context here.
Rob, you want to chime in, or shall I?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, I'll just provide just a quick overview, and then Sam, please jump in. So this is Rob O'Donnell, I should say, from the Mass Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed, and we have a team here that's been working with District Management Council for the last almost year now to develop some data reports using the finance data that we do collect, some of which is at the school level. So this graph looks at instructional spending at the school level, which is the financial data that we do ask districts to report to us by school, and also maps that against performance measured by the graph on the right is showing the percent of students in each school that are scoring proficient or advanced on the MCAS exam, the state summative assessment. And the left-hand graph is looking at a metric that we derive from student performance data that we call student growth percentiles. So it looks at how student growth is changing over time at the school level. So what we're trying to the point that Marguerite was making, we're trying to get at this question of productivity and allow districts to compare themselves to similar districts, and in this case schools. We have a district graph as well, but obviously this one is school focused. So we want them to identify exemplary schools that they might be able to compare themselves to who may be performing higher with the similar groups of students. So just to explain the data points, the orange circles are the elementary schools in the district that has been selected. So we have a lot of small districts in Massachusetts. This would actually probably be one of our larger districts, given the amount of elementary schools that are indicated, or medium to larger districts. And so those are the performance of those schools and what's being spent in those schools from the instructional cost categories per pupil. And then the blue circles are other elementary schools that have similar percentages of students that are identified as being socioeconomically disadvantaged. So those are schools that are serving similar populations of kids to the district that has been selected. So it's more of an apples-to-apples comparison in terms of the kids that are being served. So that's really what we're trying to get at. We're at the kind of the beginning stages of working with these data reports with a group of pilot districts. So we're eager to kind of report back to this group as far as how that's going. Sam, do you have more to add to that?
Rob, I think you, oh, go ahead.
No, it's all right. Jump in.
Rob, I think you covered these graphs well. What I would maybe just want to touch on is stepping back, some of the other components that I think we've seen make this really powerful for the districts that have gotten their hands on it and that have already gotten them sort of excited to dig deeper. So the first thing is that what you're seeing here, the orange circles are from one particular district, but then they're also able to select a group of comparison districts that we help them winnow down based on, they can choose whether they want to look at districts that are similar in their student populations, if they want to look at their similar budget per pupil, so that they then are comparing themselves to other towns that have similar levels of wealth. And they can even look at other factors as well, so that they're, or for example, geographic proximity, because we know many LEAs want to know how they compare with other districts in their same region. And so I think what we've seen in districts that have picked this up is that it's very powerful for them to be able to build a comparison group that they already feel is valid. And so then when they see where they stand, oh, well, we're getting much lower performance and still spending the same amount, they aren't as quick to write it off with all of the potential differences between themselves and the comparison group, because they've already built a comparison group that they felt would be something that they could really hold themselves up against. So that's one thing.
Filters are going to be really important, because if people want to use the data, the data has to be able to answer their concerns, like, well, who am I comparing myself against, and so on. And if you look at this one, I mean, this is a great example. The orange circles, you know, they're relatively more expensive than their peers. Some of them are beating the odds. On average, they're beating the odds. Some of them are still lagging the odds, and that's a way for them to have a conversation of, we do have a little more money than our peers. Have we leveraged that money to do the most for our kids? Have we figured out how to use that money to drive improvement for our students? And in some cases, yes. In some cases, not yet. So I think there's really a lot of great implications that you can find from these data.
And we have a question from Tyler from Maine. He asks, when small schools or small districts are mentioned, he's wondering what's considered small. So Rob or Sam, can you weigh in on that?
Yeah, we've got a lot of districts in Massachusetts of varying sizes. I think our average district size is probably about 3,000 kids or thereabouts. So, you know, and that's, as Sam said, that's kind of built into the tool. So you can select districts that are of similar size to you in order to account for that. In the
you know
analysis.
what? I should have brought our rural data, and it's all districts that are under 3,000. I'll send it to you.
Okay. Yeah.
That
so
would be another filter you'd want to do, right? Because that it's very different to be comparing a 60,000 or an 80,000 or even a 5 or 10,000 student operation to one that's smaller. And even among the really small districts, we find quite a bit of variation both in spending and outcomes. But I will definitely send you our report on that.
Yeah, the other piece too that I want to add to this is also built into the tool. We've got a kind of a data sheet that users can access that kind of gives more detail behind these data points. So you can actually pinpoint, if there's a school that stands out to you on the scatter plot, you can actually pinpoint that school to be able to identify it, get some more data metrics about that school, and even potentially reach out to that district if you so choose. So we've tried to provide that support as well within.
And I think that is going to be the key for when districts really start to learn from each other. I mean, one thing right now, I don't know if you all can see my mouse, but there's a school down here at the bottom. It's relatively expensive and frankly pretty lousy, I guess, based on these metrics. And we might want to click on it, and if we could find out, oh, geez, that is you know, a school that's just been reconstituted. Maybe it's a school affiliate, you know, it's a school alternative school for kids who've been expelled from other schools, or things like that. Then you immediately could say, all right, that's an asterisk. That school, even though it's in this group somehow, it's really not a comparison point. Or you might look at this one and say, you know, this relatively expensive, high performing, or maybe one of these up here that's really, really, really beating the odds. And if you found that's a school with a selective admissions plan, you might say, okay, they're really not comparable to us even though our filters haven't corrected for them. So I think the data, in order for it to be useful for people, has to do exactly what you said, Rob, and give people the information they need.
Right.
Yeah, and the last ingredient that I would add is that we wanted people to be able to then go a step further and really figure out, when these differences exist, what's driving the differences. And because we realize that districts have access to information about their own finances to some extent, more or less in different districts, but they can look at their own finances. But if they want to compare themselves with one of these others, it isn't usually something that they have the ability to do, to say, can we figure out what they're doing differently with their dollars relative to us? And so there's actually a whole suite of reports that go behind this. This is almost just the entry point to pique people's curiosity. And then behind that, we allow them to dig in and figure out, is it about class size ratios? Is it about special ed programming? Is it about the differences in students that we have, or other operational factors? And so I think we wanted to give them all of that information coming from the same source, so that they wouldn't have to reconstruct and tie their own information to something that was provided from the state.
And we've found that sometimes if you're comparing, let's say, two schools like this one and one at the bottom, you might find there isn't really much in the way of spending differences. One is just able to get greater outcomes. And that's actually important too, because that can allow a school leader, maybe a principal, to come back to their team and say, we can't blame it on the fact that we don't have the same resources or aren't spending them the same way as other places. It's really in all of us. We need to roll up our sleeves and get to work, because they have what we have, but they're making it work for them. And so I think that's part of why it's so important to compare the financial to the outcomes, even if there aren't differences in the spending.
Right. And just one other point, this is Rob again, one other point I'll make. We're very cautious to tell users of this information. We're not trying to in any way suggest that spending ties to performance, as you were saying, Marguerite, but it really is to sort of get at, what are these schools doing that are performing at this particular level with the same funding that we have.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And that's, I think, where it becomes a school improvement tool. So we Sorry, somehow I got muted there. So no one heard that last bit. Okay, so I'll jump back over. Sorry, I'm not sure how that happened, but I was going to say that yes, you're absolutely right. I lost my train of thought now. But anyway, moving on to the next piece, we want to make sure that we've counted the full complement of spending for districts, and the DMC slides show instructional spending only, but school districts put different things in the instructional bucket and in the non-instructional bucket, and it may be the case that some of the non-instructional spending is incredibly relevant. And I would say, even as a parent of a teenager, or 4 teenagers really, that many of the things that schools do are part of the students' motivation to keep getting up and going to school every day. Things like dances and sports and all this other kind of stuff, maybe non-instructional spending, having good data systems at the district office are part of the complement of services that are provided to schools. And so we want to be able to capture all of that money somehow, partly because it'll be the law to capture it all, and so the systems will need to take that into account. And remember, all the examples we showed you today are not part of the were not designed to meet the ESSA requirement. They're designed for other very useful purposes. But in this picture, Afton shows us 2 different districts that they've worked with. In one of them, Central was 35% of the total pie, and in the other one, it was 46% of the total pie. So there'll be that just kind of raises that next question of how do we, what do we do to make sure we've captured all that money? And I'm going to jump on to our next bit. Will be to start asking states to take a look at their own data. and I'll turn it over to Katie to do this.
Great, thanks so much. So we're gonna do something, we're kind of calling it a data inventory. And this is not going to be a standardized process. We don't have some, beautiful checklist or, flow chart that's going to help every state get to what you just saw, those visualizations. We have 22 different states in this working group. We imagine there's 22 different starting points. But as we shared before, we did kind of bucket everyone into one of 4 categories. And so we have some specific questions for each of those categories that we can walk you through. And Marguerite's going to do that in just a second, but you're going to be asked, if you'd like to share kind of your answers to these questions based on your data availability in your state.
Which can then actually start helping us put together tools that will help more states walk through this process. But if you were on the call last time, you see that we had roughly grouped SEAs according to 4 buckets. On the left, there was if the SEA and the state had a common chart of accounts, including a field for location. Number 2, if this SEA had been participating in SLFS survey through NCES, which is a school-level finance survey, or had some sort of similar data. And then we had, and I'll actually just go back for the first bucket for the chart of accounts. We had asked, does the state actually collect that general ledger data? Does it have the chart of account and location? There are some states like California, they have a chart of accounts, it has the location code, but the state doesn't collect it. And in fact, a lot of the districts aren't using it. And then embedded in there are they assigning real or average salaries as part of that? If they haven't collected it yet, is it out there? Is it in pilot phase? Where is that? So the second big blue box was this SLFS data, and there could be, if you just wanted to stay with that data to comply with a requirement, there will be a different set of metrics that you can use, a different collection procedure, and so on. And third, there are some states that don't have either of those things, but they do happen to have real salaries and benefits with location codes, and that's a different kind of data that can help create an expenditure picture in states. Because salaries and benefits tend to make up 80% of the spending, it's a possible way to start. And you might look if your state has all school personnel or maybe only certificated. In the last box, the SEA hasn't really proceeded on this. So we're not sure we've categorized states correctly here, but we thought we would, as far as doing this, you'll want to check which box you're in, and then if you are in that box, start asking yourselves a set of questions or assign them to someone on your team to sort of look through. If you're in a common chart of accounts state, are the LEAs using it with fidelity? Sometimes we look through these. I just looked through one from the other day, and according to the chart of accounts, this code should never be, an object code should never be used with this particular purpose code, and yet half the districts are putting those together. So you want to know, how good is the data right now? Does it record the average or real salaries? If they're average, you'll need to find a way to swap the average for real, the real for average. Sorry about that. What portion of the funds are coded to the SEA? Sorry, that should be the LEA or the school level. So how much are they coded down there to the school? If the coding is only used for 20% of the expenses, then you don't really have much school level data. Do the LEAs use chart of accounts to report the expenditures back up to the SEA? So are they kept in that file? Is it digital data? When does it happen? Does it happen a year after? Does it happen a month after? The requirement right now says that there is a December deadline following the fiscal year, and that might get changed in regulations or might be adjusted in regulations, but you'll want to ask that question. And then, are all the codes kept in the file when it gets reported back to the SEA? So the location codes in there are all the different purpose codes, things that tell you whether or not the money is spent on special education, federal money, and so on. And there'll be a list of these questions for each box. So for box number 2, for states that are using that SLFS data, you want to, here again, find out what portion of total district spending is captured in the SLFS data, and how much money do you still have to chase down to sort of parse it. Does the SEA have a file on all the LEAs that parses it for central functions? So if the district's spending district money on special ed, food, transportation, etc., can you layer that on to the SLFS data and get the full capture of spending? Again, this question about timing. So we're basically going to have this list of questions for each of those 4 boxes, and let you use them to work with your state to sort of dig up the answers, and that'll give you a much better starting point to coming up with a data plan. So if you're a state with real salary data, do the staff have application codes? What positions are included? Are they teachers only, certified staff only, employees? Do they include benefits? There needs to be a percent FTE, you know, kind of a function code like special ed. Can you tell which positions are federally funded? And that's a requirement as well. If some LEAs contract for certain things, you know, we need to figure out how we'll capture that kind of money. Again, what's the timing? Some of these, they don't have them for a year or 2 after. Are they adjusted mid-year when teachers leave, so you can get a real capture of expenditure data? And then is there a subset out there that are using common chart of accounts? Do you want to try to build on that instead and go that route? And the last one, the no access. These are, I guess, scoping questions for you. Is anyone using the common chart of accounts? Is there an appetite for that? What can you realistically ask for from an LEA? How many LEAs do you have? And that kind of thing. So if you're starting from scratch and you want to do this the easiest way, you can get some limited data. It may not be that good. Do you want to go all in and go with a statewide chart of accounts and get what you need to create a richer picture? So that's the sort of layout for the questions you'll be asking. And I'll turn it back to Katie to talk about your kind of beginning steps toward a data inventory and how we can think about that.
Great, thanks. So like Marguerite mentioned, this is not mandatory. No part of this working group is mandatory, but the purpose of the working group is to provide technical assistance. And we can provide better assistance if we know your context better. So we will have a kind of like a blog kind of format up on our website that's listed there on your screen next week, where you can go and you can open it and you can post your answers to these questions based on where your state falls. Again, not required, but we're going to be reading it. We're going to be responding to it. We're going to be asking you additional questions if you are responding. So it'll be pretty interactive. It'll be a way for you to get some questions answered that you might have about your individual state context. And it will help us build future webinars so that we know that we're supporting you in your state in the way that you need to be supported.
And potentially, partner you with some of the different partners that we'll have. Some will have done a lot of work in certain areas and some with others, but we want those kinds of, the data capture is a way to help make this working group more relevant to each of you.
Yep, and there'll also be a space where you can upload data. So if you want to say, you're not sure about your answer to the question, but you have a data file and you want to share it with us and ask us if this data file fits a certain criteria, we will have spaces available where you can upload your data. We also have office hours. We have 2 office hours set for the rest of this month. So we'll be on today until 2:30 Eastern after this regular call. And we'll also have 90 minutes set for December 19th and also after the call on the 13th. So 3 opportunities if you have specific questions for your states around this data inventory, we're happy to address them.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of our models is to stay on after the hour each time for another half hour. So if anyone says, I didn't understand this, or we're having this problem, are you going to end up addressing it, or we don't know what to do about this, that we're there and available after everyone. And then we had originally thought maybe we'll make one of these meetings on December 19th. Then we thought half of you might not be interested in that sort of closer to holiday week of having a big meeting, so we just turned that one into an office hour session. But that's your chance. And then some of the leading states who are further along in this work have time set up as separate time set up as well, and so there hopefully will be lots of opportunities for you all to engage with us and potentially some of the partners.
So our next meeting will be on December 13th in 2 weeks, and the topic is going to be on salaries. So using actual versus average salaries, and Delaware has generously provided to or volunteered to participate in that call as well and share some of their information around their salary files and kind of the lessons that they've learned doing some of this processes over the past year or so.
So we'll be able to dig in and see one of this big issues is around salaries to find out what kind of patterns will emerge and where. They're not going to be uniform across all the districts. They matter in one way for small districts, and they matter in a different way for suburban districts, and a very different way for urban districts with vast differences in student demographics. So we'll just be diving into that to take a look, because I know we've heard from many of you that that's an area of question. We'll also be helping you figure out how to look inside, individual districts, to look inside their data to kind of pull out those patterns. So any more questions for the general meeting before we sign off? We used up your whole hour and exhausted you with a lot of data. The slides will be available if you want to look a little more carefully. And as we mentioned, the webinars are recorded if you want to share them with teammates at any time.
And if you want to stay on and ask any questions, you can just raise your hand and I'll unmute you and you can ask away.